Hi pilgrims, this is Nadine from Nadine Walks, and I'm here today with a video to talk about reservations on the Camino. So reservations, should I make reservations? Do I need to make reservations? Can I walk a Camino without reservations? What is it going to be like walking during COVID? I'm going to try to address all of these questions. So this can be a kind of big topic, and I have a lot of experience with the Camino and also with making reservations, not making reservations. But if I've forgotten anything, please leave a comment down below this video, share your experience, let me know what I forgot. If you have any questions, please ask and I can try to address it. I think I'm going to try to really divide this video up into 3 different parts. The first, just kind of generally talking about the Camino and kind of some of the questions that come up with reservations and really some of your considerations if you want to reserve or not, if you should reserve or not. And then the second part, I more specifically really want to look at COVID and now kind of walking in this pandemic and how that might have changed the landscape a little bit of the Camino and kind of add more considerations when thinking about reserving or not. And then finally, the last part, I'm going to spend just a little bit of time going into some specifics about how to make recommendations. So I'll share what I have done in the past and also some additional ways that you could make reservations if you choose to. Okay, so reserving beds on the Camino. I'm mostly going to be talking and focusing about reserving albergue beds. So these are, in the sort of hostels that pilgrims stay in when they walk along the Camino. So these are mostly, albergues specifically for pilgrims. When it comes to like hotels or pensions on the Camino, I don't have as much experience with this because I usually stay in albergues. I think there it's probably more standard to reserve ahead. I think it's a little riskier to just maybe hope that you're going to get a private room and just show up and hope that they have an available space. So generally when we're talking about this idea of should I reserve or not, I'm going to be focusing on the albergues. I'm also going to be focusing mostly on the more popular routes. So talking about reserving on the Camino, we're looking at walking the Camino Francés, the Norte, Primitivo, the Portuguese. I think when we get into the lesser traveled routes, there are just extra considerations about reserving that don't necessarily apply when you're walking one of the more popular routes. And I mentioned this when I shared the video on the Chemin du Puy, but it is pretty standard to reserve ahead a day or two when you're walking and staying at the Gîtes in France. When you're on the much lesser traveled and more isolated routes, it's just really important to kind of plan a little ahead and know if there are going to be beds in the places where you're staying, how far you're going to have to walk. Depending on the time of year, you may always need to reserve. So we're really just going to focus more on the popular routes when talking about reserving. So I think I also want to say that there is no right way to do the Camino. That could be a whole other video and a whole other topic. But when it comes to making reservations, I think it's really important to me to share that if you choose to make reservations for all of your nights on the Camino, if you choose to plan it all out before you leave home, if you choose to reserve just a day or two ahead as you're walking, that is completely fine. If you choose to not plan at all, to not reserve a single night, to just play it by ear and just kind of walk as short or as far as you want in a day and just stay wherever you can find a bed, that is fine too. So any way you want to walk the Camino is an okay way to walk the Camino. I do think that the ability to not have to reserve and plan out your whole trip is a kind of special feature of walking a Camino, and it's a really unique kind of a thing. So I know that a lot of pilgrims who go on the Camino do really like the fact that they don't have to do much planning. Walking the Camino is this really simple kind of experience, and some of that is, you just have what you need, you put on your pack every day, you go out, you walk. It really reduces life down to kind of just a few simple elements. And I think this idea of not reserving and planning sort of adds to that simplification. And I know that's a benefit to a lot of pilgrims. So when I first walked a Camino back in 2014, I walked the Camino Francés from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port to Santiago, and I didn't reserve at all. I did actually reserve my night in Saint-Jean. I was kind of nervous before the trip, and with all the travel, I wanted to know and be assured that I had a bed to sleep in the first night. But that's the only reservation I made, and I really loved walking the Camino like that. It was just such a different kind of experience, and it was so freeing to just kind of be able to go out and decide in that day what I wanted to do, if I wanted to stop short, if I wanted to walk longer, if I wanted to just stick with my friends, some days, I had a destination in mind and then I'd arrive at the place and not get a great feel from the city or the town. And so I would just keep on walking. And those are all really kind of cool reasons to not make reservations. And I think, again, it's like the Camino kind of gives you the ability to sort of travel in that way and have that experience. And I think it can be a unique one. And so those are all kind of reasons why someone would not make reservations. Generally, on these more popular routes, there are enough albergues and enough beds so that if you don't reserve ahead of time, you will find a place to sleep. I think there's also this kind of sense of that the Camino will provide. You hear that a lot. The Camino will provide. Trust in the Camino. And I believe in this to an extent. I think sometimes the Camino doesn't provide. I've had a few examples of that where I've had to scramble a little bit and figure things out. But I think for me, it's also been good practice that even if as I've walked, there hasn't been a bed where I wanted to stay, I've been able to figure it out. So generally, it does work out that you can find a place to stay. Now, I'm going to talk about kind of that idea a little bit more, talking specifically about COVID and walking during COVID. But I would say in a pre-COVID world, you could generally head out on these more popular routes without making reservations and be able to figure it out. I do think one caveat to that is on some of these routes, if you're walking at a very popular time of the year when a lot of other pilgrims are on the route, if you're walking maybe a route like the Norte, and if you walk in the summer and you're going through and by all these coastal towns and villages where a lot of tourists come to stay, then the options for beds are going to be more limited and it might be a little harder to find a bed to sleep in. Again, at the certain time of the year, if you're in sort of that last 100-kilometer stretch, especially on the Camino Frances from about Sarria to Santiago, that can get really crowded, especially in the summer and especially in August. And I know that in recent years, some pilgrims have had to reserve in that stretch because it's been, albergues have filled up and it's been very hard to find a bed. So those are some considerations. So even if you do approach your Camino without making reservations, there might be a few different times and a few different stages on your walk that you might choose, or a pilgrim might choose, to book a couple of days. So reasons then that some pilgrims would reserve. I think, the idea of just kind of setting out and not knowing where you're going to sleep, potentially walking in some areas where there might be a bit of a bed race, right? So like not enough beds for the number of pilgrims who are on the trail on any given day can be really stressful. For pilgrims wanting to stay, again, in a private room, then reserving is a good way to go. I also think if you're traveling in a group, it's not as easy to show up in a town, at the end of a walking day and count on finding enough beds for your group. So I have almost always walked solo, and I think as a solo traveler, it is easier to be able to find one single bed at the end of the stages that I'm walking. So those are all considerations why someone might reserve. But now let's talk about walking the Camino during COVID. So this brings up all these other considerations when thinking about whether you want to reserve or not. So I walked on a couple different Camino routes in the summer of 2021. So last summer, I was walking at the end of July and the beginning of August. I walked the Camino Primitivo and I walked the Camino de Invierno. And so I'm going to kind of focus my experience more on the Camino Primitivo because that is one of the more popular routes. But for the Camino Primitivo last summer, I did reserve all of my beds. And a big part of this was because I was walking during COVID. So I think there was a big question of what the Camino was going to look like during COVID. We know that a lot of albergues were temporarily closed, some permanently closed, and the ones that were open and opening up last summer, they were operating at a reduced capacity so that they could space pilgrims out more. So I think in a lot of the albergues, they would only have beds for 50% of the normal number of beds that they have available. So, if an albergue normally had 18 beds, they were only offering 9 to pilgrims. I think some albergues might have been at even more of a reduced capacity, down to, at 30%. So there were just not as many beds as there typically are on a Camino, even a more popular route like the Primitivo. And so knowing this and just not really being sure how many pilgrims would be out there, I really wanted to reserve ahead to know that I'd have a place to stay. Now, there were a lot less pilgrims when I walked last summer, and I think in general, the numbers were a lot lower last summer. But again, because of the reduced capacity in the albergues and the reduced number of albergues, I think a lot more pilgrims were reserving. My experience on the Primitivo with the pilgrims I met, I would say, at least, 50% reserved, 50 didn't, but I'd say it was probably a little bit more that were reserving. Maybe between 60 and 70% of pilgrims were reserving their beds, and then the other maybe 30 or 40% weren't reserving. And generally, I found that it did work out for the pilgrims who didn't reserve ahead of time. I think there were a couple cases there where they couldn't kind of end where they wanted to end, or where others were ending because there just weren't enough beds. But I think for the most part, everyone did find a bed. I was very happy with my decision to reserve. I think it gave me the peace of mind. I think just knowing the kind of person I am, I would have been too stressed out during my walk, or just too preoccupied with where I was going to stay that night. And I think I really would have raced through the walk to ensure that I could arrive by like early afternoon, mid-afternoon at the latest, in order to try to find a bed. So I think a lot of pilgrims last year in 2021, so who walked especially in the summer and the fall when Europe kind of started to open up more, I think a lot of pilgrims did reserve, and some who maybe typically wouldn't have reserved did. Now, I think as of the recording of this video, we're at the end of February in 2022, looking ahead to the spring, this summer, this fall, I know lots of pilgrims are planning their trips. And right now, I don't have an answer about what's best to do, if we should be reserving or not. I'm kind of asking myself this too, as I'm looking ahead at planning hopefully a spring Camino, but also definitely one in the summer. I think what I plan to do, and kind of my best tip, would be to reserve the first couple of nights of your Camino. I think this gives you some time to kind of know that you have a bed for the first couple of stages, and to get a sense of what things are like on the ground. So you can get there, you can see the number of pilgrims, you can see, if the online sources that usually say which albergues are open, if they're accurate, if there are more albergues open than what's being reported in the apps and in your guidebook. I think that's really important. I think getting to talk to the hospitaleros and hospitaleras who are kind of running the albergues, get their input and see what they are experiencing. They might be able to tell you, oh, actually, there are not too many pilgrims, there are plenty of beds, you should be okay not reserving. Or they might say, these are the sections where there just aren't many beds, and it's really important to reserve here. So I think if you are kind of on the fence and you want to walk the Camino but not reserve beds, I would say making reservations for a few stages and then kind of seeing what things are like when you get there would be a good way to go. I think if it's something that you're really kind of nervous about, then go ahead and make reservations. When I was on the Primitivo last summer, my approach was that I reserved the first 5 nights, I think, before I left for Spain. And so I did it from home. And then when I got there and was walking, after those kind of first 5 stages, I reserved a day or 2 ahead of time as I walked. And I think maybe in 1 or 2 cases, I reserved the day of, just in the morning. So I think you can do reservations all kinds of different ways. Again, you can plan out the whole trip, but I think generally on the Camino and on these routes, it's okay to just sort of reserve a day or 2 ahead of time. And that should be plenty of time to ensure you have a bed. That being said, there's still a lot of question marks about the Camino and COVID this year walking in 2022. I do think that more albergues will be open. But unfortunately, I think some of the albergues that right now are closed temporarily, I think it's possible that some will end up closing permanently. And so I do think there's a chance that on these more popular Camino routes that usually have enough infrastructure to house the number of pilgrims walking, I think it's possible that there may be some sections where there just aren't enough albergues or enough beds. I also think that there's going to be a greater capacity in the albergues compared to last summer. I don't know that all albergues will be at 100% capacity this summer. I hope so. But I think for the albergues that are open, there will be more beds available than maybe in the last couple of years. So let's talk now about how to make a reservation. So if you are going to reserve, or if you think you might reserve once you're out there, what's the best way to do it? So I've done it in a number of different ways. Again, for my Primitivo last summer, when I reserved from home, those nights, those first 5 stages, I did it by email. So most of the albergues, I found the contact information. Usually there's a phone number, email listed. And so I sent an email. I think being here in the States and calling to Spain was a little more difficult. I also don't speak Spanish, so calling is going to be trickier for me. So I sent an email and all of the albergues did get back to me. Usually it wasn't the most immediate response. It usually took a day or two, several days. So I would say that email could be an okay way to go if you're reserving kind of a little bit further back, maybe several weeks back, because you want to give the people running the albergues a chance to get to their email and respond. When I wrote the emails, I just used Google Translate. So I put the message in Spanish, and that was a really easy way to do it. So email is one way to go. I think calling, when you're there and in Spain, I think especially if you can speak Spanish, calling is probably the easiest way to do it. Even if you can't speak Spanish, I have called a couple of places to make reservations when I was in Spain, and I was always able to communicate what I needed. It wasn't always really pretty, but I was able to do it. So calling is definitely an option. Some of the albergues have a website, and they have a kind of booking place or a booking link on the website so that you can directly through their website kind of fill out a form and make a reservation. And then there are also like the online kind of engines that enable you to make reservations. Booking.com is probably the most popular one in Europe and for the Camino routes. So not all albergues or places to stay are on Booking.com, but there are a lot that are. And, Booking.com does take a percentage of the fees. So booking directly with the albergue is always a little bit nicer because all the money will go to the albergue. But Booking.com does have its advantages. It's easy to figure out. You don't have to deal with the language barrier. There's often, for a lot of them, cancellation policy, so that as long as you cancel a couple of days before, you can get your money back. So, and it is also really convenient and easy. And I know that a lot of people have used Booking.com. I have as well for some of the nights that I've reserved. And then I think the other kind of final way I want to talk about is through WhatsApp. And this was just something that I did a few times last summer. So WhatsApp is kind of like basically a texting messaging app. It's widely used in Europe. And a lot of the albergues, I shouldn't say a lot, several for sure of the albergues on the more popular Camino routes, their phone numbers are linked to a WhatsApp, and they'll take reservations that way. So basically, I would open the app on my phone. I would enter the number for the albergue into WhatsApp, and if they use WhatsApp, a little kind of message would pop up and say, this number is using WhatsApp. And then I would just, again, using Google Translate, just type out the Spanish of, can I make a reservation for one night for one person, and put in the date. And this was usually a much more immediate way for the albergues to respond. I would almost always get a response the day of. And I did that with a couple of nights that I was on a stretch of the Camino Frances. So I know, even though I walked the Primitivo in Invierno last summer, I was at a couple different points on a few stages of the Camino Frances. And I think of like the 3 albergues I stayed in, all of them were on WhatsApp. So that's another option of making reservations, and I think is a pretty easy and convenient one for a lot of people. And then in terms of finding contact information for the albergues, guidebooks are a great place. They'll list the different places to stay with the address, the phone number, email if they have it, website if they have it. Different Camino apps are really great. Wise Pilgrim is a popular one. Buen Camino is one that I use a lot. And often, at the end of the stages, they'll list the places to stay, sometimes with a link right to Booking.com, or else information about how to contact the albergue. I use Granze a lot, and so that is a website that's all in Spanish, but it's really easy to navigate. And that too really breaks down the different stages of a Camino, and it shows all the lodging options for the different places to stay, and it will list all the contact information. It'll say if they accept reservations or not. It says the opening hours. So I found Granze to be a really convenient way to kind of plan out some of my stages. So I hope this video was helpful. I know it's a lot of information. And I know it's also not a necessarily black and white situation in terms of should you be making reservations, should you not. I think, if you're planning to walk a Camino this year, I would just kind of consider the fact that reservations might be important on some stretches of the Camino that you're walking where they might not have been as important to do in the past and pre-COVID. So basically go in being a little bit more flexible. That's not to say necessarily that pilgrims are going to have to make reservations. I think it's still going to be possible to just kind of go out there and find what you can find and walk how you want to walk. And if that's not making reservations, that's okay too. But I think reservations just might be kind of part of the experience of walking the Camino a little bit as we kind of figure out what, the Camino is going to look like in this COVID world. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the comments. If you like the video, click the like. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. I'm gonna have a lot more content coming soon, and also hopefully some videos on the Camino in a little over a month or so. Fingers crossed. I'll have more on that to come too. Okay, buen Camino.